share out my desktop here. And we'll go with this one. It's coming.
Cool.
It's taking a minute to load here. Well,
I see the PDF.
you can see it okay now? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So tonight we're looking at domain 5, which is access control and identity management. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on, just kind of go through some of the objectives here. When you're taking the Security Plus, especially important, even in just security, there used to be what they called the AAA model to security, and what it was a way to look at security and think back to CIA. CIA is the core kind of values or core goals to security. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Well, the way that we can provide mechanisms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, going down that road was the AAA model. Now, they expanded AAA and then made it quadruple A. So let me give you those 3 A's. That's what we're kind of looking at tonight. So it was authentication, access control, and auditing. Okay, that's where it started. And then from that AAA, they added another A, which was authorization. Okay, so obvious definitions. Authentication is proving who you are, right? So we do various things to log on, as an example, to authenticate and to prove who we are. Then once we authenticate, then it goes through and you're then allowed access. Now, access control can be done a couple ways. We could call that authorization, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be. So like if I have the right to log on and we're talking user rights, then I'm authorized. If we're talking about giving you read, access, full control, modify, any of those, then we're talking more along the lines of access control, right? Looking at a typical access control list where you're allowed or not allowed access and at various degrees. The auditing portion is also there, though, because with auditing, we can actually validate what are the chain of events. And so just like forensics, for example, if you're looking at trying to do digital forensics, what are you trying to do? You're trying to build a story, right, to find out, in this case, what the bad guy did. Okay, so those 4 or 3 A's, however you want to put it, are core values to security, and that's kind of what this domain 5 looks at. All right, so I guess we'll start looking at authentication, or excuse me, it looks like authentication services first. So with authentication services, we use several different ones, and then the first one kind of looking at here is directory service. Now, first thing we think about when we hear directory service, we think Active Directory. And that's not a bad thing, because if you look at most enterprises today, there's a good chance that if that enterprise is running a domain, that domain is Active Directory. And so Active Directory is a domain directory service. Okay? Now that's not where it started. Of course, we start way back. We can look at Novell. Before Microsoft was a directory service, that was a very popular directory service. So directory services have been around for a long time. The idea of a directory service is a place to allow the entities here, as they identify it, to be able to interact in the environment. The way that they can do that is to validate their identity. Okay, and so we log on to Active Directory. It builds us a secure token that we can then exchange through the use of Kerberos for gaining access to file services, print services, etc. So that's a typical example of a directory service that we use for authentication, is Active Directory. Is it the only directory system out there? No. And in a second here, we'll look at some other examples. Now, to be called a directory service, what we have to have is a system to define the objects and attributes of a directory service. And so think of it like this. I always explain it like the registry. Okay, the registry is a part of Windows that allows for you to go in and customize settings, allows you a place to store values for things like user account. You create a user account. That user account then now stored as a part of Active Directory. You create a firewall rule. That firewall rule is now stored as a part of the registry. Excuse me. So what we have in a directory service, similar to that, is what is referred to as a schema, or in this case, a directory schema. Active Directory has a schema, and what that schema allows us to do is define what are the objects and what are the object attributes that we can create for our environment. So an object would be something like a user, and then an attribute would be something like their first name, their email address, phone number, those types of things. So most directories, if they're a directory service, have a way to define what is available for defining, and that is referred to as the schema. Okay, so that's a big part of a directory. Is you got to have the foundation, if you like, or the framework for what you're going to define. That's referred to as the schema. Very similar to a database schema as well. What can be defined of the attributes of the database. All right, so do you guys know what LDAP is? I'm going to let you guys interact a little bit here. Save me some voice. What can you guys tell me about LDAP?
So a way that, say, other devices can authenticate via Active Directory. So, for instance, like our MFPs at work, our printers at work, could use Active Directory to authenticate a user via LDAP.
Yes. So LDAP itself, right, is used heavily in Active Directory. And the way that it's used in Active Directory, it's a query language, right? LDIF is the language that we use to interact with the LDAP service. Now, imagine, if you would, I need to look up attributes of a user or a group or a computer in a directory service. So I need a service that allows me to interact with a directory service to harvest that information or pull that information out. Okay, so LDAP is the ability for me to go off and create queries of the directory service and then have that information available for me for consumption. Now, I can do a lot with it. I can go in and just query it. So that might be what I want. I want to find out if you are in the domain admins group, for example. Or I might want to make changes. So there's a lot of things you can use LDAP for. Now, I'll take you through an example of something I use LDAP for from an offensive security perspective. So if you look at the way that you test an environment from a security perspective, one of the things that you do after you go off and start scanning the network to try to find out information like open ports is you start to do something called enumeration. What can you guys tell me? What's enumeration? Have you heard that term before?
Defining, say, all the usernames in a directory.
Nice. So you can see where bad guys and or pen testers would want to find that information out, right? Because that kind of information leads to furthering the attack. Does that make sense? Okay. So enumeration, a big part of a pen test. Okay. And we can do several different types of enumeration. We can do NetBIOS enumeration, obvious to what we're doing there, trying to find NetBIOS information. Now, I'm sure you guys know NetBIOS is enabled by default in Windows. Now, you're saying, well, what can I do with NetBIOS? That's a different topic. We could talk about that later. But you should look up things like a null session attack and the ability to kind of authenticate without having to authenticate. It's kind of scary. So you can get some good information by just doing NetBIOS queries, believe it or not, and enumerating NetBIOS. Now, one of the types of enumeration other than NetBIOS is things like DNS. Now, of course, I don't really have to explain this probably to you guys, why we would want to get DNS information. It's useful in furthering our attack. So all enumeration attack is going to help us to build a further attack against the environment, to understand the environment kind of like knowing your enemy, so to speak, is going to help you further the attack and make it more legitimized. So with LDAP is not secure by default. You might not have known that, but it uses port 389 by default. So unless you go down here, you can see where it's mentioning secure LDAP. Unless it's using secure LDAP, then that information is available for anybody that is running packet capturing or monitoring of that network, and it can even lead to things like man-in-the-middle attack and active types of sniffing attacks, like we call with a man-in-the-middle attack. So I know you're saying, well, do I need a lot of permissions to do LDAP enumeration? No. All I need, and this is very low-hanging fruit, is a user account. With a standard domain user account, I can use tools like JX Explorer, or I can use, let me see some other ones. I might have even some more just here on my desktop. I don't want to take the time up to kind of look, but there are several other LDAP enumeration types of tools that I could use with this a standard user account to start browsing the environment, okay, with not even having much, but just a standard user account. All right, so that's the first thing. We're going to see a lot with security, unsecure protocols. LDAP is, by default, if it's the 389 one, the one that is not secure. So we want to look to secure it by using secure LDAP, which uses port 636. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. You can see where it would be an important aspect of directory service if it is querying a directory store that has information that's pertinent to the domain, like user attributes, for example. Okay, so we do want to secure it. That's definitely something to make sure you know. All right, so here's some of the other directory services I was mentioning to you guys. Active Directory is a very popular one that we use. Today, if you're in a Microsoft environment, it's probably most likely the one you'll have that is a directory service. But you can see from this list, it's not the only one. They even have Open Directory or OpenDS, which is also another it's open source version that's available on multi-platforms. And there's one Open Directory there at the bottom that's Apple's customized version of that can integrate with Active Directory. And so it's not perfect, but as a solution, it's real good for if you have a need for some Mac integration and some other integration there with Active Directory, for example. So there's lots of options there for directory services. So definitely have a good feel of what those are. Now, here are some of the vulnerabilities. So I know you guys know what a single point of failure is, probably. If not, by the name of it, it means that if this one system was not to be available, then that would lead to a total devastation. And so we rely so heavily on authentication, as you would imagine. If we can target that authentication server and bring it offline, then we can cause a denial of service, right? I'm sure you guys get that. Unencrypted transmission of data, if it's not protected, like using secure LDAP, for example, then yeah, it's going to be scrutinized. So I'll tell you one classic example. What I'm looking for, even before I go and attack a domain controller, is I'm looking for, is it running domain services? And so a clear indicator that it is an authentication server is if it's got Kerberos. So Kerberos is a network authentication protocol that's used heavily with Active Directory, and if I see port 88 on that machine, there's a good chance. I mean, that's the Kerberos port. So I'm looking to target that resource to do those types of targeted attacks, denial of service, man-in-the-middle if it's not securing the information, packet analysis, any of those types of things. All right. Now, just like most systems today, we want to have a good measure of availability. So if the Active Directory service is a target, one of the things that you can do, and this is awesome, one thing that I think, and I've even started to do this myself, I've tried to, on all my engagements, I've tried to create kind of a best practice guide for things that a company should be doing. So think of it, if you're on the defense, right, these are standard kind of, think of it like a security health check, things that you should definitely be doing. At the top of that list should be backups, right? And so we see so many times today with the use of like ransomware and crypto locker that if those systems get infected and there's not a good backup, right, you're toast. So having good backups and just that's just a good security hygiene in general. Backing up Active Directory is a classic way to do that. So in this little exercise here, they kind of had me walk through that, but it's super simple to do. If you want to back up Active Directory, all you need to do is on the server, you go to Windows Server Backup, and then in the Windows Server Backup, you choose the system state. Okay. Now you can also use a tool called NTDS Util as another tool there to make a backup. So there are command line tools as well to make a backup, but the moral of the story basically have a backup. Okay. All right. So looking at the domains or domain 5 a little bit more, let me see here. One of the other things that it kind of talks about a little bit here is, I don't think it talks about tunneling, but it does talk about some remote authentication. Yeah. So if you look under the authentication, there's just a lot of different kinds of authentication. Now, local authentication is obvious. Domain authentication we just mentioned. If it is using remote authentication, there are several types as well. And so trying to find them in the domains there. I don't really see them listed here. Well, anyway, we'll kind of look at them for a second. So if we're using dial-up still, then one of the authentication measures that we use for remote access is, or remote access protocols that we use, is point-to-point protocol. So they mentioned that one here. It's a standard. It is still available if you're using point-to-point or dial-up connections, but paving the way for, of course, more of a dedicated type of connection or more of a faster, higher speed connection. You get things like point-to-point tunneling protocol. However, with each of these protocols, you can see we're trying to create kind of a tunnel, a VPN tunnel, in this case for all three of these here, that allows for secure connectivity over the internet. Now, obviously, that falls under the camp of authentication because once we set that tunnel up, we're going to be authenticating to a VPN server. Now, the problem here is with each of these methods, there's pros and cons. So, for example, PPTP is really easy to set up. Okay. However, it's really vulnerable. It uses a type of encryption called Microsoft's point-to-point encryption, which was the same encryption that was supported here with point-to-point protocol. And there's tools out there that are very capable of beating up on this particular VPN tunnel. And so, in most cases, with this one, PPTP is not recommended anymore. So most of our systems today are going to be using something like, if it's remote access, going to be using something like L2TP tunneling protocol, and then here, or if it's something like TunnelBear or something like ProXVN or something like that, then it might be also using something like Secure Socket Tunneling Protocol. The advantage of SSTP over something like L2TP is it uses a standardized port, 443. So that's an advantage, and you don't have to configure the firewall rules or anything. Whereas with L2TP, you have to configure port 1701. Okay, but there are some advantages. Now, L2TP by default for the test takers does not provide any level of encryption. Okay, so you must use IPsec with L2TP to get that encryption. The nice thing about IPsec, not only does it provide encryption of the data payload, but it also provides authentication or integrity checks by a checksum. So there are some advantages to using this type of obvious encryption over that one that was up there with PPTP. However, it doesn't necessarily come without a burden of having to configure things. All right. Now this one is mentioned also under authentication in domain 5.2. Do you guys know what one-time passwords are? Have you guys heard of that before? Just throw that out there. And if so, what's the idea?
So it's just a password that's only good for one authentication or one login.
Right. Have you guys ever used like Google Authenticator or anything like that? The you can use for multi-factor authentication? Well,
Yeah.
if not, yeah, something like that, or RSA has those little things that look like sticks of chewing gum, so to speak, that has the numbers that randomly generate. Those are really good. They're really good because they alter so very often. Okay, and so the chance of being able to replicate that at that point in time is, impossible, right? Because those numbers are constantly changing. So for the test, what you want to know is one-time passwords are by far the strongest form of passwords that we can use, okay? Because there is no password reuse, anything like that we would see with standard traditional passwords. You don't have those with one-time passwords. Now, sometimes we'll have HMAC one-time passwords. So HMAC, basically hardware MAC level authentication or hash level authentication, allows us the ability to embed in the device, like a smart card or something like that, protection against keys that allow it to produce that one-time password that we're going to achieve. And so we could use that. It could be that it's tied to the actual operating system as well. And so a lot of these, as it mentions here, use HMAC one-time passwords. This is the one that the Google Authenticator is software-based, that basically every 60 seconds it will go through and it will produce a different value for me. And so the idea of, and what you should be getting from authentication here, is that if we use more than one type of authentication, just not relying on just passwords, then that's going to protect us at a higher level. So we're not having to worry about, in this case, if somebody gets our password, if we're using multi-factor authentication, they also have to have this thing. Plus, in this case, by adding this one-time password, it adds such a level of entropy to the authentication process that there's not a good success rate for someone that's trying to, in this case, as an attacker, trying to gain access with a password, because they also need this one-time password to gain access to the system. So anytime we can, with authentication, add multiple authentication layers, then that's going to definitely produce a better result and a stronger authentication mechanism, right? Passwords aren't dead yet, but they might as well be, because overall password reuse and all the problems that we have with passwords today, there's only a matter of time, I hope, until we find a better method for protecting our resources. But it's kind of laughable, don't you think? A lot of people, they share passwords, or they create the crappiest passwords that there is, and then it's a big joke.
Yeah, password reuse, I think, is probably the most rampant, I would assume.
It's horrible, right? So if you get one person's password for one site, then you just try it on all the other sites, and there's a good chance that people don't want to make systems complex, so they'll make systems lowest common denominator, easiest way in, kind of thing. And it's sad, but that's just the way it is, I guess. All right, so a couple other authentications that you want to know just specifically for the test, because here they're just going to test you to make sure you know that what's what. So password authentication protocol is the weakest authentication protocol that there is. It is used with systems like VPNs for point-to-point tunneling protocol, or LTTP or stuff like that. However, you can see that it sends the username and the password in plain text, so there's no protection whatsoever there at all. So unless there is some weird reason for you to use password authentication protocol, you'd want to disable it. Okay, and it is. In most modern-day systems today, like even Windows 7, if you create a VPN connection in Windows 7, it's not enabled by default. All right. So another one that we have for authentication is a challenge handshake authentication protocol. And Microsoft even has their version of CHAP called Microsoft CHAP, or MS CHAP, and there's two versions of that: MS CHAP version 1, MS CHAP version 2. The idea, and you can kind of see it in the graphic here, is what will happen is the remote client will try to authenticate with the remote access server. The remote access server will send back a challenge. Okay. Now that challenge has to be responded by the actual client with the correct information in order for that connection to complete. Okay. So if that response that the remote client is giving back to the remote server is not a valid response to what the question was or the challenge was sent back to the client, then the authentication is not allowed. Think of this as a handshake process. Here's the different steps that it goes through. It creates kind of a nonce, and then expects some value to be sent back to based off of that challenge from the client. And as long as the client can then respond with the correct challenge, then it will go and take that challenge with the password and then send that over to the resource. And if it matches, then it allows access. If it doesn't, then the server closes the connection. So it is one of the ones. However, there's tools out there like Chapcrack, for example, and if it's got a name like Chapcrack, obviously it's not as secure as other platforms. Most, and it's unfortunate they don't mention it here that I can see in the objectives, but most authentications that are VPN types of authentications that are anywhat worth their salt in protecting resources, probably going to use another kind of protocol called extensible authentication protocol. With EAP, you can use things like smart cards and certificates and other things, other multi-layers approaches to authentication. It's going to provide a lot higher level of success and a lot less level of threat. All right. So that's just some quick things. Yeah, just as a tip, you know, obviously anytime you can incorporate one-time passwords, that's a great multi-factor authentication. Use tunneling as much as you can to avoid just open internet, especially with things like hotels. If you've got remote servers that are out on, or excuse me, you've got sales team that are out on the LAN, so to speak, and you want to protect those resources, it's a good thing to have something like a VPN connection available for those guys.
Do you know of any solutions that are out there that integrate with Active Directory for, like, creating one of those OTPs for Active Directory?
So you can use several mechanisms, even Google Authenticator in Active Directory systems, especially ever since Server 2012. There's been several expansions on multi-factor authentication in Server 2012. So I would just look up that and see what are some multi-factor authentications that you can use with Active Directory to get the best result. But yeah, absolutely, you could use multiple authentication schemes. All right, so the next thing I was wanting to show you guys this, but I didn't get a chance to pull everything up before we get started tonight. So let me see if I can find it real quick and I'd mention it to you guys. All right, so I'm gonna set the link into the chat real quick here. So this is a product, okay, and it's a free product for Windows-based systems. Now I would go to and I would start playing around with this. You can play with it. It is a free open version of PGP. And if you go to the website and you start, you know, looking around, like where's the part? I think it's under Getting Started, where you can actually go through some steps. Yeah, they actually walk you through how to use the tool. And if you've got multiple email accounts, you can definitely play around with it a little bit. But even local, if you want to play with it local, like just taking a file attachment and kind of encrypting it and stuff like that, you can do some of that local. Okay, so let's talk about PGP for a second. Okay, so PGP stands for Pretty Good Privacy, and what it allows for is your ability to go and take email and secure it by using public key cryptography. Okay, so the way that public key cryptography works, if I want to send, let's say, Corey, I want to send you something encrypted, okay? So what I've got to do is I've got to be able to access your public key, encrypt it with your public key, and so that the receiver can decrypt it with their key and then access the contents, okay? So the advantage to something like this is if I send it to you and somebody gets it, then it looks like just a bunch of garbage, right? If it goes to the intended recipient, then they get it and they can unlock it and they can see the message. Okay? So ultimately what it is doing is it's allowing us to protect the integrity and or the contents of the message. Now, how does it do the integrity part? Okay? Well, it does allow for you to digitally sign the email. Okay? Now, what digitally signing does is it basically allows me to take my private key and I take the email, I hash the email, and I encrypt that hash. Then when I send it to you, you can decrypt that hash with my public key, and then because you decrypted it with my public key, you can then evaluate you put that e-message through a hashing formula or algorithm. It outputs a hash, and if the two match, then right there you can see that it's integrally sound. That's what we use hashes for. But in addition to that, I know it came from you. I have what's called non-repudiation because I was able to unlock the hash with your public key, and the only person that should have your private key is you. Does that make sense? So PGP is very useful for protecting data privacy of email. Okay. Another service that I used to use, I don't even know if it works anymore, is Hushmail. That's another one you could play around with if you didn't want to download a tool and you wanted to still kind of try it out. Here, I'll put it in the little chat there. Either one of those, there's some probably good examples that you could use to just get some good practice with what PGP is used for. Okay. So typically, and I don't know if you guys have seen it yet, sometimes companies will publicly, they won't list out their email, or they'll have a mechanism where they want you to use a PGP key to send them email. So they'll make that public key available globally to everybody. And the idea and the protection against this particular service is it doesn't matter that we give out the public key because that's never going to give us any kind of issues. What we need to protect is the private key. Okay, so in this case, if the contents ever got, if we ever got the private key, then that would be game over.
So if you wanted to send, say, one of those companies an email, and you grab their public key and encrypt the email with that public key, even you, the sender, wouldn't be able to decrypt that email.
Well, I mean, you would have it before you even encrypted it. You would have
yeah. I mean, you'd have a copy of it, but once you encrypted it, I mean, you wouldn't be able to. I'm just working through that in my head.
Yeah.
You'd have to have the private key
to
be able to unencrypt that email.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you play around with those tools, you'll see you can actually with Hushmail, you can when you sign on and send and somebody sends you an encrypted message, when you open it and look at like without decrypting it, it just looks like it'll say PGP signing starts here or whatever, and it'll have the message. It'll be encrypted looking, a bunch of garbage, and then if you say the option to decrypt it, then you can see what the contents is.
So, out of curiosity, and I don't know if this covered later, just let me know. Text message encryption. So, do any of these protocols apply to that as well?
So, I don't know enough about if there's any apps out there that provide that level of encryption or anything. I would assume that there is. I just haven't ever looked into it to see if there's any apps for the phone or anything like that does it. And there's nothing real too special about it. Because all you need to do is when you sign up for the service, they're going to build you that key pair that you're going to use for the service, and as long as you're using that service, then you can share the public keys within that service.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've seen one. I think it was called Secure Text, if I remember right, and that's basically what it is. You and whoever you were wanting to speak with shared a certificate back and forth, and then that way it validated who it was coming from and encrypted any messages. But
yeah, and that's exactly what it does. And for every person, like the conversation that we have is protected, but then I might create an entirely separate key value if me and Josh are talking, right? So there's the ability, and what makes PGP a little bit different than other certificate services is the keys are managed more of an ad hoc manner and what they call a web of trust. So there's no centralized authority here. There's no certificate authority with PGP. It's just almost like we're doing end-to-end encryption, basically, between ourselves, and then the conversation then is only protected between ourselves. Now, if we give out something, because we have the ability to access private keys, then if that's ever compromised, then of course that whole chain of conversation is compromised, because there is no way in this case to trace that conversation back to a centralized authority. So it's not used all the time for enterprise security, because we can use certificate authorities for enterprise security, and we get even more features. So we get with PKI, which is called public key infrastructure, we get more features than we get with simple things like PGP. Not to say that it's not good, hence the name, it is pretty good, but it's not the best. There is better solutions out there like PKI that offer more flexibility and stronger integrity and confidentiality. All right. So another one of the authentications that they mentioned there is Radius, and Radius and TACACS basically. So both of these are when I am connecting, maybe through wireless or I'm connecting through VPN, and I want a way to centralize all my authentication, then I can use a Radius server. So it's used for three things. It's used for authentication, it's used for authorization, and it's used for auditing. Okay, all three of those. And you might say, well, why do I need one of these? You might have lots and lots of connections coming in through VPN or even through wireless, for example, and you want a centralized way to apply policies that govern who can connect and who can't connect and what can they access and what they can't access. And then you also want a central logging mechanism, right? So Radius authentication and TACACS Plus provide that. Now here's the key for the test, okay? Radius is UDP and TACACS is TCP. Now you might say, well, what does that really mean? Well, with TCP, everything is more structured, more organized, more checks and balances are created with TCP versus UDP. So there's a lot more control over TCP connections than there is UDP. So that might be good, that might be bad. Another thing about Radius authentication is the way that it works. Let me see here. So you have these things in this diagram, the Radius clients. You've got these things called the Radius, the remote clients, the Radius clients, and the Radius server. The connection that is between the clients and the Radius clients, so these two, it's not protected. Okay, so the protection doesn't come in until this client has authenticated with this server through this proxy to allow access to the infrastructure inside. So there is and that's what they're mentioning here. There is another form of Radius called diameter, right? Twice the radius was the joke there. And it provided a stronger mechanism of security and protected all the interaction points between the remote clients, Radius clients, and Radius servers. Does that make sense okay? All right, so the two things there so far, Radius uses UDP, TACACS Plus uses TCP, and the port numbers, I'm a little lost on those. I can't remember all the numbers, but you'll have to look those up. I think, gosh, I think one of them is like 1812, 1813, some crazy numbers. But anyway, you need to know TCP, UDP, and you need to know that Radius is more vulnerable to certain situations, certain types of attacks, I guess you'd say, of authentication because of the problem between the Radius client and the and the remote clients, and not having protection there between those resources. All right. Also, know TACACS Plus is a Cisco proprietary protocol, okay, or developed by Cisco, and so that might work for some situations, but maybe not all situations. So I'd say 9 times out of 10 for the test, at least, TACACS Plus is going to be used more because it has more options for security, scalability, and everything else, and Radius is just not as powerful, I guess. Okay.
Looked up those port numbers. Radius UDP is 1812. TACACS was 49.
Awesome. Yeah, it's hard. It's so hard to keep up with some of those, man. All right. So, all right. Let's see. Moving ahead a little bit. Another authentication type that's mentioned here under the domain 5.1 is Kerberos. So Kerberos is pretty popular. In fact, I'd say most systems, especially in the enterprise, are going to be using Kerberos authentication. Active Directory, of course, uses Kerberos authentication. And there's a lot of reasons to use Kerberos. So one of the big reasons to use Kerberos is something called single sign-on. Okay, so what single sign-on does for us is we sign on one time, and then because the environment trusts us, and once we've signed on that one time, there is no additional signing on. So take it back a step. If you didn't have single sign-on, then that means every time you wanted to interface with the file server, you'd have to sign on. Anytime you want to access the web server, you sign on. Anytime you want to access the print server, you sign on. So it becomes this on the domain controller, it becomes a nightmare because the domain controller is getting worked like a dog because it continually has to authenticate all those clients every single time, and it is not a system of trust. Okay, with Kerberos, you can build the trust, and what it does is once you're authenticated for, I think it's 10 hours, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe a little less.
Can't you control that amount of time?
Oh yeah,
Right? Yeah,
absolutely. But that's just the default. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
So that's great for that 10 hours, which is, I mean, typical workday or something. It might be a little bit more. I can't remember. But that's a good amount of time for your token to be validated and not have to worry about authenticating again and again. There are some caveats to it, though. With Kerberos, for example, if we're going to issue out a token for authentication, then it has to expire. Okay, so the only way that it can keep track of that is through the network time protocol. And so if the domain server that is keeping track of time is not keeping the clients up to date with the authentication server, and that threshold by default is 5 minutes. Okay, so if it's outside that 5-minute window, when you try to authenticate to a resource, it's going to say access denied, even though you know you have access. So it's very time sensitive, and if your domain is not synchronized correctly with time, Kerberos authentication will fail.
Personal experience, it borks things up quick.
Yeah, I can imagine.
If the time is off, yeah.
Sure. All right, so here's the steps that it goes through. I'll leave that up there for a second, but it's pretty straightforward. It's like going to the fair. You get basically a ticket to get in, and then if you want to ride a ride, you get another ticket, and then you submit that ticket, and you gain access. So it's really straightforward, but you don't have to authenticate. Once you're approved, you're approved. And that's it. Okay. So, have you guys heard of SAML? I'm going to let you guys talk for a second. You heard of SAML? It's another type of authentication.
So I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar with it.
So, how about Connect to Facebook?
Yes.
Yeah. So, the way that Connect to Facebook works, right? You go to a site, and you don't want to have to create a whole other account for the site, right? So, if the Connect to Facebook option's there, that site has created a trusted relationship with an identity provider, and then because of that trusted relationship, if you can go to that site and approve you want to use your access at that site with that identity, then guess what? It says okay, that's good to go. So a lot of systems today, especially useful, can use SAML authentication as a mechanism to have a web-based single sign-on. I can sign on one time with, a good example is Microsoft, right? Can't you use like your Hotmail or Outlook account for a lot of different services, right? And the option there, if I can do that, it makes it streamlined. For the user, they don't have to create all these different accounts. They create one account, and as long as the trust is established, they're golden. Does that make sense okay? So that's another type of authentication that's out there. All right. And I think that's all of the authentications in 5.1 that they kind of talk about. All right, so the next thing under 5.2, what can you guys tell me? What's the difference between identification versus authentication versus authorization? We're going to look at that, I guess, in this next section. What's the difference? Let's start with identification versus authorization.
Identity is who you are.
Right.
Authentication is what you are?
Yeah, proving who you are.
Okay.
Right? So if identification is your username, authentication, the process you go to validate that you are who you say you are, right? And then once that authentication is complete, the authorization is what you can do. Does that make sense? So with that said, okay, in this section, identity management, area that's focused on basically a way to maintain your identity in the environment. And so typically, on a big domain, we would use as an identity management system something like Active Directory. It's a way for us to create information about you as a resource or as a subject, and then we can later, with that subject created, give you access or authorization to objects in the environment. Okay. All right, so that's one big thing. Definitely understanding what is identification and what is identity management. Account management, of course, here is what policies do we put in place that govern you, right? One example of this might mean we go in and we say that you're a remote access user. So because you're a remote access user, if we don't put you in the remote access group, then that remote access policy can't apply to you, right? So sometimes we'll have policies that will specify what level of authentication you're allowed through the use of account management, okay? And a lot of that is based off of jobs. So when we go in and create things like groups, we're always looking for defining the groups typically based off of what your job function is. And then privileges is all about permissions. So I can grant you, or I can put you, excuse me, into a group, but that doesn't give you any permission to a folder or a file server or whatever. I've got to go in, I've got to authorize by giving you permissions. And so typically you have two types of account privileges you can set. You can set user assigned privileges or groups privileges. And in most cases, if you've been doing this long enough, you probably know that groups are easier from a management perspective and or a best practice. And so by following the group concept within the organization, we could easily take Sally out of one group, put her in another, and if the structure of authorization is set in place for that group, then we don't have to do any more. Whereas if we just go off and start individually giving direct access to resources from to a subject, then that's a lot more management that's required over each of those resources. So it's a much better thing to do account-driven management through the use of groups. Okay, does that make sense? All right. Now moving on down a little bit. 5.3 talks about account policies and what account policies are. Okay. So account policies a lot of times come along with identity management and basically set the stipulations for the users and when we create users. Okay. So when we create a user, it's just not, we don't just go into Active Directory and start creating users. We have to have a planned approach to creating those user accounts, what groups they need to be a part of, all the resources they need to have access to, the badges that they need to have, you know, the training that they need to take. All those types of things are a part of the creation or the new employment enrollment, if you like, for the organization. So when we do and look at some of that stuff, these are some of the things we look at. And a classic example of admins is that most admins need to have multiple accounts, right? I'd say it's a best practice. So you might have, I might have an account named Ralph that I use to log on with just standard domain user access. And then when I need to do things as an administrator, I log on to an account named maybe ralph.adm, right, for admin. And so it's definitely a best practice to do that. If you're not, well, then you're creating no separation. So if your one account gets compromised, it's got too high level of an access. Does that make sense okay too? So that's definitely an important thing, is look at the accounts that you're creating and determine whether those accounts then need, or that user, excuse me, needs multiple accounts or not. It's unlikely, but there are certain scenarios where users within the organization will share accounts, right? So, like, let's say if it's a lab or something like that, and for tracking purposes, or licensing purposes, you have to log on with this one account with username and password to access the software because you only have one license for the software. So you might go in and you might share accounts, but it's always very guarded. It should be absolutely looked at and evaluated to make sure that that's the road you want to go down. Because if you start sharing accounts, what are you going to do? You'll share passwords, and that down the road to not really being that secure. So that's definitely something that has to be scrutinized, has to be evaluated, and has to be determined if it's something that you're willing to, as a company, associate as a risk. All right, so some other things there. Here talks about multiple accounts.
Are you talking to me?
And shared accounts. All right.
I got a nightmare.
All right, hold on a second, guys. I'm going to go. Can we pause it real quick? I'm sorry. I had something come up real quick. I'll be right back in 2 seconds.
I keep trying to scroll his PDF and it's not working.
The last couple sections, I definitely remember practice questions, basically asking about, like, what's the best authentication method for this particular scenario, and they'd have some of the things like Kerberos and um, EAP and all that stuff listed.
Yeah.
Same thing with like group policy and stuff like that. It's like, what's the best way to manage all the people in this size business, and then they'd talk about a certain A, B, C, and D different policy methods.
All right, guys. Sorry about that. My son had a little nightmare, so he's good now. All right. So where were we? Okay. So another type of authentication that that's under 5.2 talks about federation. Okay. So what federation is big today. Okay. I'm gonna tell you how it's going to get bigger. A lot of companies are starting to implement hybrid implementations in their infrastructure. Okay. So not all the time is all of the services that, and or servers that you're going to be accessing on premise. Right? And I'm sure you guys have heard the cloud's getting big, right? So with cloud implementations, right, most companies have to create a mechanism that allows them to kind of reach their hand out, so to speak. So reaching their hand out really is creating a trust between themselves and that service provider, that third party. Okay? And what is this known as? This is known as account federation. So account federation means that I can still keep my account here local on premise, but if I want to use SharePoint in the cloud, right, I can gain access to SharePoint in the cloud with my local account, because what we've done as administrators is we've set up a authentication trust between the identity solutions provider and the identity service and the solution provider. Okay. So it requires usually it's a certificate agreement or an exchange of certificates between both parties, and then once this trust has been established, then users just sign on and access those resources. So today and or in the future, we will see a lot more of this federation of services where we allow the user to still log on with their one account, but then access multiple resources with that one account. Does that make sense okay? That's another type of big one.
Yeah, and that's done. Well, you would still have Active or something like Active Directory in that case to authenticate the user locally, but then it would go into that account federation scenario with SSO for those other services, right?
Yeah, and so it's usually called claims-based authentication. So if you look up claims-based authentication, that's what we're doing. SharePoint would be a claims-aware application, and then the claims provider would then create us a token that we could use on the site with all of our claim information that can then assign us access to resources in that environment. So it definitely is something very similar to that. So there still is an identity management solution as a part of it. All right, so looking at account management security controls. This is, I think, stuff that they'll have. Let me see. This is just good best practice stuff, it looks like here. So let me see some. I don't know where this is mapping to in the domain exactly, but things like you would want to have a least privilege model when you're giving and or granting access to resources. So that just makes sense. That's a best practice to follow anytime that you do that. Now, have I seen that fail? A lot of places, right? So a lot of places, they think they need admin access for everything, right? So if we follow the security mindset, what we should be doing is pushing that, right, a little bit. We should say, well, do you really need domain admin, or do you really need admin privileges, or is it just a few checkboxes of things you need to be able to accomplish your task? Okay, so definitely look for that model being of least privilege being an important aspect of account management. Other things involve of account management. Some accounts we have that we create, like temporary accounts, and they're only valid for a certain period of time. So what you can do in Active Directory is you can actually go in there and you can set how long those accounts are for. So if it's a summer intern, we set the account we set when it expires the account, and then we don't have to worry about that account being there forever. Okay. Another thing that we do for account management is we set lockout for accounts. So after a certain duration of the number of logon attempts, then it locks that particular account out. Another one that we should be doing there too is, if it comes down to it, we might set stipulations that say that the account that you're going to log on with in Active Directory can only log on to machine A, B, and C. Now that is a little bit restrictive, okay? But if it comes down to a breach or not, if it's a high-level account, then that's something we might want to do. We might want to say, well, okay, you're an admin. You can do most of your management through maybe this machine, so that's the only machine you should be logging on with that particular admin account. Okay, so you can do some of that, and it requires this constant monitoring of resources to evaluate to whether or not the accounts are high privileged or not. Okay. Let's see. I wanted to share something with you guys here. Let me get the link here.
I'm just glad as we go through a lot of these things, I'm just sitting here like, yeah, we do that. Good, we do that too.
So that's great. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Come on, Bleaky. I want to share this with you guys. This is a tool I think is really good as an auditing tool. I used to use a tool called Goldfinger, and what Goldfinger, which it sounds right, was used for is domain auditing. Okay, and one of the things that I kind of now built through things like PowerShell or Python, etc., is mechanisms to go off and test privilege. Okay, it sounds trivial, right? Overall, conceptually, that you would want to keep an eye on who's in your domain admins group, right, or enterprise admins group. But not always, through the life cycle of we might have inherited something. Do we know who has all those different high privileged accounts? Okay, so really that is where it comes in, and we start doing more auditing. We start doing more account management that's driven towards looking to evaluate privileges and who's doing what. Okay, so I think anytime you can find tools that look for privilege level access and who has this level of access, it's always going to be a useful best practice to know who is in those particular groups. Okay. Now in that section, and this is what I was going to show you, but I tried to install it on my VM. It did not work, unfortunately. But there was a tool that I wanted to share with you guys, and you probably already know about this tool. I'll put the link here and just talk about it here a second. Have you guys heard of a tool called Splunk before? It's amazing, right? So what I found, and what I do now is anytime I go to a big business, like this week I'm working down at the Savannah River Water Plant, and anytime I go to a big place like that has a dedicated security team, I always want to know about 5 different things. I want to know what type of DLP they use. I want to know what kind of vulnerability management they have. I want to find out what kind of monitoring services they use. There's several things, about 5 different things I ask them. And I would say more than I'm willing to count, 9 times out of 10, when I go into a company and I say, what is the solution you're using for log analysis? 9 times out of 10 is Splunk. Okay, so I was going to show you guys a demo of it, and how this relates to what we're talking about here in this section is continuous monitoring. Okay, so the idea of Splunk and what it doesn't really do anything. I mean, yes, it does. It's a really nice tool because The problem with log analysis is we get so much logs, right? So being able to sort through those things to look for what are the anomalies is probably the hardest battle, right? So what Splunk does with its filtering techniques, one of the great things it has is it helps to brew to the top some of the things that are concerned. So I can just open up Splunk and I can go in there and I can type in, I was going to type in, I didn't get a chance to do it, but I was going to type in, failed passwords or something like that. I would be able to access and or see through there what are all the various different failed passwords. So I'm going to use a tool like this to dig into my logs and get a better overall view for the things and the operations that are happening. Now, we'll be sharing with you guys, there is a free Splunk Live is coming up very soon. I had an email for it. I registered for it. It is in Charlotte. It is on March 29th. Okay, it is free, and it's not the first time they've done it. And it is a really good kind of like it's a dedicated sales pitch sort of thing. But they have lots of good little breakout sessions and seminars. So if you're trying to use or trying to find more of what is a great tool for log analysis, Splunk is hands down the best. Okay. So anyway, in this section, that's what they're focusing on. That's another avenue that we can focus on with auditing is looking at what are failed logon attempts, what are maybe users trying to escalate their privileges, what are the people that are trying to create new accounts, all of those types of things. We would start to draw some of that out by the use of some of that continuous monitoring, that auditing. All right. So let me see. In 5.3, they talk a little bit about credential management and group policy. So credential management is basically, in Windows, we can use a tool called the Credential Manager. I mean, it literally is called that. And it's been around, I think, since Windows 7. The idea of it is if you type in some password information, you should be able to store that in a vault and use that when presented with the authentication information. So you don't have to remember your password. In this case, the system can remember the password for you. Now, it is using 128-bit, I think, AES encryption, so it is using standard level encryption to be able to do that. And it works pretty good. So in this exercise, they had you kind of walk through and store your credentials here. So when you go to a site or something like that, you can gain access to it. Now, on a Mac, we use something called Keychain for that. So there are systems out there that are able to use a secured store to store your credentials. I mean, I use LastPass, KeyPasses, and 1Password are also mentioned there. So the idea of these credential managers is I can create very strong, very secure passwords for all various systems, and that's going to, one, help me with password complexity. It's going to help me with creating strong passwords in general, and in addition to that, not doing password reuse. Right? Some of the tools like LastPass, it'll let you go through a security audit to see if you're trying to maybe you have used multiple at multiple sites, multiple same passwords. It'll let you do an audit and see how well your security is posture-wise for your credential set. So any of those things are useful tools. Now, can they be hacked? Yeah, absolutely. So there is always, I think at ShmooCon, I was listening to the this month's meeting. Jeff was talking about ShmooCon. They had the one where it was the LastPass or whatever. That was a phishing attempt, right? Right now, I'll be honest with you guys, if you use Beef, there are hooks in Beef that allow you to go through and present all kinds of little things that look like LastPass or whatever. So you can create these fake toolbars and make it look like a legitimate thing. As you would expect phishing, there's nothing that in that case you can do but user awareness, education, those types of things. But anyway. So any of those would be useful for storing credentials over a period of time. Now, what can you guys tell me about group policy? How can I use group policy as a measure to protect the accounts in the environment? What can I do there for using group policy?
Enforcement of all, password policy and restricting. The group policy, you can't really restrict what they have access to, but you can apply policies to, well, so you can push out, what I'm thinking of is like pushing out shared drives. For some users, just it's enough for some users to not even see something to keep them from trying to access it. So it's just a way of kind of changing the end user experience.
Oh yeah, yeah, it definitely is. I mean, you can change the desktop, and
Yeah.
there's just a ton of things you can do for the accounts. Think of things like it can let you set what's called a password policy, and then with that password policy, you can set how long the passwords are used for. The what they call the maximum password age. You can choose things like how many passwords are remembered. So in this case, they can't keep reusing the password over and over again. You can set complexity that say you got to use upper and lowercase and special characters and such. So group policy as a mechanism to control the actual passwords, there's a lot of things there. It can also do things like lockout. So after a user tries their password 5 or 6 times, it'll lock that account out until an admin comes back and actually unlocks the account. So there's just a lot of different things that group policy can actually do from an account management perspective. In addition to that, there's also with group policy, or not group policy, excuse me, in newer domains, you can actually set multiple password policies. So the nice thing about multiple password policies is you've got things like service accounts and admin accounts and those types of things. You might want to set a higher level of, I guess, protection around those accounts than you would with the standard user account. Now, of course, standard users, they need all the help they can get. But the idea ultimately should be that we should have the option, which is nice in server, to set multiple precedents for different password policies, different complexity levels, because some of the ones that have a higher level of privilege, like the admins and service accounts, yeah, they need to be protected maybe with longer passwords, and maybe ones that if we did that with a user, they would just write it down because it was too complex, right? All right, so I guess that's about it. I'm looking at some of the domains there. Do you guys see anything else there in 5? I don't see anything else that we hadn't kind of mentioned, at least in some degree or fashion. It does talk about biometrics with identification. I mean, biometrics itself, there's so many different versions of it. For the Security Plus, you really just need to know some of those. So like there's retinal scanning, there's iris scanning, there's hand geometry. But you want to know the problem with biometrics?
Non-repudiation.
Yeah. So you're always relying on, not having issues. Let's say a lady comes in one day, and if you're doing hand geometry that measures the peaks and the valleys, and she got some long nails, right? That's not going to work, right? Can't measure appropriately the peaks and the valleys because of that. So those types of things, the mechanisms with biometrics, there's this thing called a crossover error rate that has to be a good balance between a type 1 error and a type 2 error, which is false positives, false negatives. And if it doesn't have a good balance between the two, what's the good of it, right? And so we'll have things that we let some people through that are not authorized, and other people that are authorized, we won't let them through, right? So I think in that section it looks like there's just know the various different types of biometrics that are out there. All right. I can't think of anything else. I hate that my demo didn't work. I'll have to maybe try that next time if I can get some more set up ahead of time.
Well, cool. Yeah. So do we want to? When do we want to do our next session? I guess.
We can throw that around an email. I mean, I don't know. Okay. I'm trying to see. Next week I'm in town, but I don't know of anything that's going on. I do have a lunch and learn. By the way, those lunch and learns are free if you guys want to come. It is next Thursday at lunch at TC. Pizza. You'll just have to let me know ahead of time. I can get you guys registered, and it's going to be on security. But I don't see any reason not to do it Tuesday. If something comes up, I'll look into it. I'll ask my wife and stuff like that, and make sure nothing's going on.
Okay.
I think it should be fine.
Well, I'll send out an email and just kind of poke everybody and see. We'll see if I can't get some more people to come. I don't know if a lot of people are watching the videos or not, but.
So the next one's going to be pretty big. We're going to do like cryptography and stuff to kind of finish it out. So, probably going to be some OpenSSL and maybe some like steganography and some other stuff there.
Okay. Well, cool. Yeah, I'll send out an email here in the next couple of days, see if we can't poke some people and get some more, see if anybody's interested what day and that kind of thing. So.
Sounds good. All right, guys. I'll catch y'all later.
Yep. See y'all.
See ya.
All right, thanks.